Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where I talk about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of The Blacklist Redemption. So in this episode, there's basically a black site known as Davenport. It's basically a place where the CIA, illegally, on domestic soil interrogates people. And basically there's a bunch of people that end up escaping. It turns out all of this was kind of like a smoke screen for one particular person to escape, and his name is Brian Mayhew. And Brian's like this big time hacktivist. Essentially, he kind of it's all a system of like, hey, like beware Big Brother. Like he's always done situations where like it's always been bad things. He's never really done anything. I mean, obviously he's hacked into places, but he's never done anything bad with the information, just exposing like government secrets and stuff like that. It's like, oh, that they're hiding from the like people and stuff like that, but never anything that would jeopardize people's lives necessarily. Well, essentially he went to jail for, well, I mean, not necessarily even 100% in jail because there's a whole CIA thing involved, but basically he was connected to this whole missile system thing. I don't know whether it's like codes to the missiles. Basically, like it ended up getting sold to someone else and he got blamed for it, but he's saying like, oh, I was framed for it. So basically his whole escape thing was about clearing his name. Basically he had to to get access to the information he needed access some NSA backup files, which the NSA backs up its files on like the CIA website apparently. That's kind of interesting to me. But basically to get access to it, he needs, basically there's a group meeting of the 7 keys, because one of the people the person he targeted in this episode, his name is like, I think Max Adler. He's basically one of the people who has one of the 7 keys to the internet. Now, I'm not sure what it was before, but I feel like there was something, and somewhat recently too, that had that like storyline too that brought up the 7 keys. That's why I'm like slightly familiar with it. Basically, it's a system to protect you. Essentially, like using an example of like a website, like the 7 keys ensures that no matter where you are on the internet, that you go directly to the real site and not just some site that a hacker creates, that might look like that site, but is actually something they made so they can steal your personal information. The 7 keys kind of plays a role in all of that. And it's like, I feel like I've heard that somewhere recently and I just can't quite place it. If you do know, if you've like, for whatever reason, like might be watching the same stuff I'm watching and know exactly, it's like, oh yeah, Michael, it must have been this I pulled that from. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting thing. Obviously, there's a lot of, I'm sure, a heavy amount of technical jargon behind it, but the fact of the matter is I'm not that, like I said, I just only know it because I do remember it coming up in something once. But nevertheless, basically all this has been about clearing his name, and now he has to deal with the fact is that they're trying to actually kill him for trying to clear his name. Because obviously it was a situation that's like, because the moment he was caught, he was like, oh, we're not getting out of here. The point is to just stay here. And because he even got his friend involved, which his friend ended up getting killed later on in the episode for just kind of, because he didn't want his friend mixed up in all that. He wanted his friend's help, sure, but it wasn't about going after, it wasn't about, trying to fight their way out of here or trying to get away. It's like, no, he just needed the information, the proof that he was legitimately framed. Because what it turns out to be, like, basically what happens is that you ended up finding out that basically the one behind all of this is that dude Jack. And basically this has all been like, essentially Brian wanted to expose the fact that the NSA doing what it's doing illegally, looking through everything, like, and using the example of the cafe, like, the fact of the matter is they gathered information on a lot of those people. It's like through their laptops, through their phones, like kind of real-time video of, like, you see the footage of, like, real-time video of them, like, spying on people. And basically they kind of spoofed Brian's, IP address to make it look like it was him who did the attack when it was actually someone else that was actually hired by this dude. But essentially he's a private contractor, and that basically Brian was basically going to expose some things. And basically this Jack dude wanted to use him as a scapegoat to make it be like, okay, the fact of the matter is people don't realize that, it's just people think the war is on these fronts, but the fact is there's the cyber front of it as well. So it's like he basically created a situation so that people would be like, oh, the fact is we should buff up our like cybersecurity and stuff like that, take this a little more seriously. And at the same time, he ended up getting a contract of like, oh, don't worry, I can step in and help this situation. And then obviously making a pretty penny off the situation. So an interesting thing was the fact is that at the very end of the episode, you had Tom being like, oh, What are you going to, like, could this hurt anyone if you released any of these NSA files? I mean, these, like, government files you got? And he's like, no. Like, obviously, he's just going to spread information that the government might not be that fond of getting out, but not something that would expose and endanger other people's lives. Like, I think, even, directly or indirectly, at least that's how it seems like it. And you see Tom actually giving him the flashlight, which I'm guessing is like, I don't know, I guess because you kind of see the fact is that Tom is kind of rebellious. I mean, he is working with housing, but it's like, it doesn't work directly with the government. It works kind of, it's an independent thing. So, I mean, he's never really been obviously he lives his life the way he has. So it's never like he's never really had 100% allegiance to anyone, because that's kind of what his life is all about, pretending to be someone else to get someone's trust so they let down their guard. So I'm thinking kind of the same thing kind of applies in this particular case, because he's kind of like, I think, a rebel in his own way. So I guess that's why he kind of let Brian get away. I mean, the fact is, it never came up in conversation, so I do wonder, is it a situation where he just did that on his own? Will Scotty and the others say that? Will they back his play? I think legitimately, I don't think they really care too much. So, I mean, granted, we'll kind of have to see in the future. Some other things that came up in this episode. One, continuing situation with Nez. We see her buying more drugs, which there's a situation of like, the guy's like, oh, this is only going to cover half of what you want. It's like, but you could get the other half. You got police connections, like, help me out with something. Basically tell me, if there's going to be any situations where it's like basically finding out if his competitors or big time drug people are getting taken out, it's like, or being raided upon, because that way, the moment they're taken out, obviously he can swoop in and kind of take their territory or take their customers essentially, or maybe steal some product while he's at it or something like that. But Naz is kind of like, no, she's walking away. But the fact is, you get the feeling like, I'm not even the feeling, you just know it's going to turn into a situation where it's like, she's just going to, she's hooked again, and we see her constantly like rubbing her nose throughout the episode, just kind of being on edge. So I can only assume it's a situation where she's just going to eventually break down and do what he wants, which, I don't know. It's going to be very interesting, because we do have the whole situation of, because I am very curious to find out what she's going to think when it eventually, it's going to probably be a while, but eventually she's going to have to find out that Howard is alive. I'm very curious to see who's going to be the one to help her. I feel like anyone is going to be Tom, because Tom's probably going to feel responsible, because it's like, she's like this because Howard's gone. And maybe he'll want to step in and try and be the new Howard for her. Obviously, he's kind of taking that step forward, being like, oh, let's go get some drinks or something. And it's just like, no, some other time. So, I don't know. I feel like that's where that might be leading to. Especially with the fact that you had Solomon following him in this episode, which I love. The fact is that Scotty was like, because basically you had Howard being so adamant about the whole Whitehall situation, but obviously Scotty's getting closer and closer to finding out about Christopher, because she learned from the private investigator that's connected to Howard, brought up the fact is that I was like, oh yeah, you meet Christopher's adopted parents and stuff like that. And what I thought was kind of interesting was, well, for one, is how the fact is that when, like, he came back, like, because Tom is most worried about it, but it seems like Howard wasn't. I was wondering, I was like, why are you so, like, the whole point that you want him to stay hidden. I was like, obviously you must have an ace up your sleeve to wait, but it's like he's so focused on the whole Whitehall situation. I was like, do you not care about this? Because when Scotty actually goes to visit the parents later on, and she sees the photo of the child and has the birthmark, I was like, oh, so either Howard reached out and possibly even threatened him, which I don't know. I don't know if Howard's necessarily that type of person who threatens someone, but at the very least, I was like, maybe he reached out to them recently and be like, oh, cover this up. Or maybe there's always been a situation where it's like, if Scotty ever comes looking for Christopher, I want you to cover that up. But then I was like, right. Like, why would he necessarily do that? Because the fact of the matter is, he tried looking for Christopher too, but was never able to find him. I mean, the question is, how did he find Christopher? I guess because Tom started asking about his past, that's how that came up. Or maybe before even like faking his death, or when, quote, in his words, quote unquote, Scotty trying to kill him, maybe then he had already stumbled across Christopher/Tom before, but he just never reached out. Maybe he'd found out way before, but he was just keeping his distance, obviously not wanting to draw too much attention, Scotty towards him. And maybe after his attempt, obviously he's like, oh, this is the time I got to bring Tom in to let him know about this whole situation, to help me with this whole situation. But I love the fact that the moment Tom was like, oh yeah, because he came up with the information about, he's the one that came up with Brian's name because he heard it from Howard. And it's like, how the hell does Howard know? Even though Howard's kind of possibly out of the loop, it seems like he's still in the loop and just knows a lot more than everyone. And then like Scott is like, oh, how did you find out about that? He's like, oh, my sources wants to stay confidential. I hope you can respect that. Moment that turns out, she sends Solomon on it, and you have Solomon following him at the end of the episode. But obviously Tom is very careful, so he's changing taxis all the time. But, you know, eventually, I'm sure, especially because now Scotty's on it being like, all right, Tom is up to something. The fact is he's trying to hide from me, so she's probably going to keep Solomon on it. But getting back to it, I love the fact is it turns out the reason it's because they weren't even the real adopted parents either way. They were like actually people hired to play that role, because the private investigator that she like muscled is actually still working with Howard. This has all been a long play. Like he's still been playing, like he's playing Scotty. Which there is a part of you that's like a little heartbroken because you do see Scotty being so, well, heartbroken about the situation. But then again, you find out, you know, hearing what he said last episode about the whole like, oh, possibly her not really being the real Scotty. I don't know, makes you wonder, dude. Like, I mean, that is a big part of this too, is like questioning, like, is Scotty really being truthful about everything? Is she really who she says to be, who she claims to be? And is Howard really in the right mindset, or is he just very suspicious and crazy? Because this is all about figuring out something about Whitehall. Essentially, it's some off the books covert operation or project that took place by House, and it wasn't really an official thing. And the moment Howard looked into it, he didn't find anything because the like project had already been scrubbed by the time he sent people to look into it. And around that same time he started looking into it is around the time Scotty was like, yo, like, my husband's not fit, trying to kick him out of the business. He's not well mentally. So he's saying that he's like, oh, I don't know what it is. Like, the fact is he never gave direct, it's like, oh, this is 100% proof that Scotty's behind all of this. And it's like, because even Tom was like, how do you know that it's Scotty? He's like, well, he kind of hesitated, and then he said something, but I was like, I don't think you're 100% sure. You're guessing it's Scotty. It's just like, I think there's a situation where there is something going on there, but I think at the same time, Howard isn't 100% right in his mind. Maybe. I mean, it's really hard to tell in this situation. I mean, this is kind of like a large scale spy game. So it's like hard to tell like who you can trust in this situation. Some other things that popped up in this episode, probably hands down, probably one of my favorite parts of the episode is obviously, some of the escapees broke into a dude's house. Obviously they were taken care of, but the guy had previously already called 911. They're trying to keep this hush hush, keep the public as well as the police out of it. So Tom's pretending to be the guy, and he comes in, obviously like before he's like, oh yeah, the reason I called you, and he basically gives him Solomon's description, and he comes into the kitchen, he's like, oh, who are you? What are you doing? He's like, and Solomon's like, I'm the plumber. He's like, wait, you call the police? It's because I'm black? Just because you find a black man in your house, you're gonna call the police? He's like, whoa, I am not racist, and turning it into such a good argument. I love it, to the point the police are like, okay, bye. And I just loved it. It was so good. I just love that. Like I said, just getting to see, like I said, you really get to see in this show that like it very pushes the very covert operations of just like playing different roles. I mean, just coming up with something like that on a spot like that was amazing. And I do love that the entire time they kept the dude like taped up. I mean, granted, they probably told him afterwards. I mean, the guy who owns the place and who had called the police in the first place probably told him afterwards that, yeah, let's keep the police out of this. We're with the government, or we're FBI or something like that. But it's like, they could have, I guess they didn't, because they were like on the clock. They only had like a couple seconds before because the police were slowly approaching. So really good part of the episode. And also we learned a little bit more about Dumont. We actually met his little brother in this episode. But the way he was talking about it, he's like, oh, your dad was right. You are blah, 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 blah. So it's like maybe him and Dumont are half brothers. But nevertheless, him and his little brother apparently don't get along. I'm very interested to find out why, though, because obviously his brother kind of sides with Brian, because it's like, oh, I need to track down Brian. He's like, I'm not going to help you, bro. You work for the government. He's like, dude, the people I work for are independent. It's like, it doesn't matter. You're ruled by the almighty dollar, being, you know, kind of like, oh, I'm not going to work with my brother. The fact of the matter is, you were mom's favorite, and look at you. Well, you were mom's favorite. Look at you now. You stood out to the man, essentially. So obviously there's a lot of blood running through there. And even Nez at one point, because obviously it's like Dumont's just using him because he knows like, my brother's predictable. Obviously after I confronted him like that, obviously he's going to call Brian and I'm going to be able to track his phone. And he's like, really? You betray your own brother? Kind of like that. It's kind of what she's going at. And I'm guessing like, I'm very interested to see where that goes from there. Obviously, the fact is they went through the trouble of introducing that whole angle of him having a brother makes me think like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to pop up later. Because I'm very interested to find out, also like where's the divide? Like, was it because he found out Dumont started working with the government? Was it because Dumont found out his brother was kind of going all freedom fighter type of situation, kind of like, oh, power, rise together and against the man. I mean, I don't know. Very, very good episode. A lot of developments. I almost forgot about the whole Trevor angle, because for Scotty, like she knows that Trevor, obviously not even his real name. We end up finding out later on it's Dan. She's like, yeah, she just wants him around because he's good company. He listens to her. He's kind of caring and compassionate. But it's a situation where she knows it's not love, but in a situation where she thought she was about to get close to Christopher again, she's like, oh, I wanted to kind of revel in this news with him, just because he's kind of the closest thing to have, somebody there and someone to hold you during that moment and be there and listen to you intimately, because anyone else, it turned almost into a therapy session. Which I get the feeling like, obviously it won't go that, but it does make you, because the whole point is to get Scotty to trust Tom more. So eventually, I guess he's going to have to step up and kind of be in a position like, oh, I want to sit here and listen to you, tell me about what's bothering you, kind of almost entering a therapy session, but kind of being like a friend to her. Because we really don't know, like, Scotty to me, but prior to this show, I would have never been like, oh yeah, Scotty has friends. To me, Scotty has acquaintances, is what I would have gone at. But as we saw with the Kevin situation in episode 2, it made me go like, nah, apparently she still does have friends, but it's like, but even that gets brought into question with the whole situation of like, what we learned last episode, like, oh, maybe she's not really the real Susan Hargrave. So it's kind of like, who's to say that she's really, really friends with her? Maybe she's just playing the long game. It's stuff like that. It's always coursing through your mind with a show like this. Because it's like, to me, it's like, it's even a step above. Like, the Blacklist always keeps you guessing, and I feel like they've translated that over very well to this show without like, just copying it from the Blacklist. I feel like this show's kind of got its own like system of deceit and, hidden secrets and stuff like that, and twists and turns. It has its own feel and vibe to it compared to Blacklist. Like, because it is like, to me, they are very different shows, and I appreciate that. It's not like they made a clone copy in a new location, a new group of characters. It's like, no, obviously these are very different characters from the team from the Blacklist, and obviously they operate very differently. So it's just kind of interesting. So. But I kind of had a feeling just the way things were kind of getting between like Susan's assistant, like at the beginning, and well, like I said, his real name's Dan. But the fact of the matter is, it does seem like they are getting closer together. But you do see that look on her face because she kind of feels bad about it, because she feels like she's stabbing Scotty in the back, because we really don't know what their relationship is, like Scotty and her assistant. Like, it seems like she's one of the few people Scotty trusts most, because it's like she, like, one of the first people she told about the whole like Christopher situation, like, oh, we're closing in, was her. So it's like she trusts her, and it's like now she's like, I'm stabbing Scotty in the back, and it's like obviously Scotty wants to be like, it does seem like she might like Dan, but at the same time it's like, but Scotty kind of cares for him too, like, So, especially now that she knows his real name, and even Scotty doesn't even know that. So, just overall, a very good episode. I love the developments, and I'm very interested to see what goes down next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.